Hello everybody. Today I wanted to do a brief presentation on structure. Now, structure is a word that I tend to use quite a bit in my classrooms, especially when I'm talking about the figure. And I think structure is a vital concept, although it's not really one that's spoken of in the same terms. But I think once you see what I mean, you'll have a better understanding of what I'm intending by this word structure. Now, the structure of a figure really has to do with the shape and the volumes of the body. Now, in this first image, these are some drawings by an artist named George Bridgman, and I'd highly recommend you look up his work. I think he has probably some of the best examples of structure and looking for those base volumes of the figure. Now, you can see what he's done. In this drawing, he's basically taken the figure and he's broken it down into some basic volumes. And what he's doing is he's trying to figure out how these volumes work together, right? So the head is basically a cube. There's your cube. And when you think of the head as a cube, you know where to put in some light and dark based on where the direction of the light is coming from. You can do the same thing with the rest of the body. You can figure out what these basic volumes are, what the volume of the rib cage is, and you can figure out where the light and dark should go. Without even having to look at the figure, you can basically know where the side planes are and where the light and dark is going to hit on the body. So what George Bridgman is doing in this is he's showing you some basic concepts about how to think of the figure in terms of the basic structure. Now this is where you start, right? On any drawing, you're going to start with some kind of a structure. And that structure may turn in several different directions. Now, of course, this is a very simple form, but of course it can get more complex. And we can see in the work of Rubens basically the same idea, right? Underlying all of this detail is a very solid structure that's based on the anatomy of the figure. Now you can see what I've put on here is just some basic volumes, right? And when you look at it by itself, it looks pretty boring, not very interesting, but it's really what he's got going on underneath all of this, right? So first you have the volume of the rib cage. And that volume of the rib cage, he builds on top of that the volume of the arms, some anatomy of the muscles. So for example, because he knows the anatomy, he has the pectoralis muscle coming here from the rib cage up onto the top of the arm. It's getting overlapped by the biceps. And again, because he has the knowledge of the anatomy, he's able to apply these and put the anatomical structure on top of the basic volumes in a pretty complex and interesting way. So even though he's starting with just basic ideas of this egg shape for a rib cage, a cylinder for a neck, right? You could think of some kind of an egg kind of form for the head. And as he builds on that, the details, the structure remains. You may not see any of that construction line, or if you've drawn long enough, you may be doing that construction line just in your mind. But all of that structure exists underlying it. This basic volume is what is giving this a really good structure and making this such an amazing drawing, right? So it's all stages of the drawing: the basic structure, the anatomy, and then the details. Now, if you aren't aware of how to look for structure in terms of value, this is an important diagram to look at. So there are basically lights and darks. When you're breaking down any kind of volume that's being hit by light, it breaks down into two things: lights and darks. Now, you can dissect that further. So for example, you have the direct light. Then you have form shadow. Another way to call this would be highlights. Highlights here and halftones here. Then you have the shadow core. Now the shadow core is a key huge, wonderful, important concept, and it's so critical because it is the point that separates your light and your dark. Think of this as the sunset, right? Imagine over here is where the light is hitting, right? The sun is over here. And let's do this. So over here you have the light, right? The sun is over here. You can think of it as a large sun, whatever it might be. But basically, as that light is coming down, at some point the light is going to go over the surface, right? And at this point here, at that shadow core, that's where light is no longer hitting onto the form. That's why the shadow core is important, because everything over here, light is hitting it directly. In some places, such as a highlight, it's hitting it most directly. And a good way to think about that is something like a disco ball, right? If a disco ball, if the light hits that, it's going to come right back at your eye, and it's going to be the most intense part of that lighting. The other parts, the light might be hitting slightly away. Now on most matte surfaces, that means that the light's not going to be going completely away, it's just going to be a little bit darker as you go out. And as you go further out, those highlights are going to get darker and darker because light is heading less directly to back towards your eye. And once you get to this stage here, that shadow core, that's where light is no longer hitting the object and it's going past it. Okay? So light may hit here, it may hit over here, but it's not hitting in this space. Now we do have another important part of the shadow, and that's the reflected light. Now as you have light coming here hitting an object, it's going to bounce back and illuminate part of the object. But it's going to do it in a less intense way. And the shadow core is usually going to be slightly darker because the reflected light is going to be stronger here, as you can see, than it is here at the shadow core. So you have a key principle that comes up from all of this. And that key principle is the lights in the dark are always darker than the darks in the light. Now I know that sounds a little bit vague, but basically what it means is imagine this is a lit up area because it's a reflected light, right? It's lit up, but it is still in the darks. It is still in the shadows. And it's never going to be as intense as any of the darks in the light. Those darks in the light would be something like this, the form shadow or the halftones. Halftones is the word I would usually use for this area. Okay? So all of this is lighter than anything that's over in here. All of this is darker than anything that would happen over here. Okay? The difference is day and night. Anything that happens over here in the light is day. Think of it as daylight. Anything that happens over here is nighttime. Even if it's moonlit, right? Even if the moon is reflecting light back onto it and it feels rather bright, it's never going to be as intense as the direct light of the sun, even if it's at sunset, right? Even if it's getting far away, that direct light of the sun is still always going to be more intense than any reflected light over here. That's a very common mistake, to make reflected lights too intense or to make halftones too dark. But if you remember your shadow core, then you'll know that anything on this side of it should be darker, anything on this side should be lighter. Okay? Day versus night. So this is a very key concept and one that if you haven't thought about or if you haven't encountered in your courses, this is very important to keep track of. Clean some of this up. All right. Now, as we're talking about structure, there are different ways that a structure can show itself in a drawing. This drawing is by a modern artist, Egon Schiele. And what you can see in his drawing is that even though it's a very simple line drawing, there's really no shadow in it. There's no sense of where the light is coming from. It's only line, and it's very, very simple lines. Just a couple of lines here and here, right, to indicate the parts of the anatomy. But what you can get underlying it is a sense that he understands the structure of the figure. So we can get a sense of the rib cage in here. And as the body turns towards the hips, we can get a sense of what that structure of the hips is. Now he's doing most of that mentally, so he has an intuitive sense of where to put these lines and how to overlap them so that those structural components can come together. Right? So all of this is the structure. Now, that's one way to approach it, and that's probably a way that many of us are more comfortable with. Because we're focused on line drawing, we tend to do a lot of line drawing. We can think of the figure in these terms, and we can use line to establish the structure of the figure. Now, occasionally we may have some line with some hints of shadow, but overall, one is going to dominate over the other. So even if I put in a little hint of shadow in an area, overall, the basic structure of this drawing is linear. Now, it may be that the basic structure is from the value. And that might be such as an example like this. Okay, so let's go back for a second and look at this image. We have, I want to say, highlight, halftone, shadow core, reflected light, cast shadow. Those are the key components. Now in here, we see all of those same things. Highlights, halftones, shadow core, there's that shadow core, and reflected light. Okay, so all of this is reflected lights. Now remember the rule. The lights in the dark are always darker than the darks in the light, and vice versa. Now this is a light in the dark, but it's darker than any of these dark areas in the highlights of the figure. You wouldn't want to make this too dark. You wouldn't want to make this too light. You want to still have that separation because everything on this side of the shadow core is nighttime. Okay? So you can map out what the figure is, especially by finding that shadow core. It might kind of come up in here, shadow core might come up in here, but all of this is the shadow core. You can see how he's clearly separated the light side from the dark side. Okay? So that shadow core is a hugely important part of your structure, especially as you start to establish where your lights and darks are. And as you start to work more with value and less with a linear-based structure. All right. One interesting thing to think about, let me go to this image first. One interesting thing to think about is that you don't have to show all of the parts of the form to make the structure work well. Look at this piece. This is Caravaggio. And this is what would be called a tenebristic piece, because he's pushed the shadow so far into the darkness. Now, we can see that there are areas where he's put in reflected lights very subtly. It's not very strong, and it still disappears into the darkness. Over here, the reflected light is a little bit stronger, but he's still pushed them really far into the shadows. And over here, we can hardly see much reflected light at all. In fact, he's allowing the figure to just disappear into the night, right? That head of Goliath just fades into the darkness. So, what is working about this is that we still get a very good sense of the structure, right? I don't have to have all of the figure and all of this shape showing for me to see where that structure is. A little bit of the light gives me the sense of where the entire head is. Back in here, I can kind of discern that. I can figure out where the edges are here. I can figure out where they are here. And I get something of a sense of where the edge of the figure would be back here. I can make a guess and do a decent job. I don't have to see every part of it for it to be a solid structure. And I think the principle, and a good way to think about it, is from this. Now this is what? This is just a line, right? Now let's say we start to pull out a little bit more information. Now we've got something a little bit different. as we pull that information out, we see, well, really, it's still just a line, right? They are just lines. But our mind interprets something more than just the lines. We actually see that as a shadow, and we end up interpreting the positive space here as if it's something distinct from the background. And I think that principle is the same as the principle that applies here. We can be given a little bit of information based on the light and dark structure, and we can fill out the rest of that information. So when I say that you should have a good structure, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should show the entire figure. In fact, you can play around with allowing part of the figure to disappear into the shadow, or vice versa. Maybe the light disappears into a very well-lit background, and only the shadows show. But still, this allows this allows the structure to work well, because we know what the figure is. We know what the light and dark is, and we know how this works. So that even if we just saw the lit area and all of this was pushed into shadow, we would still be able to figure out what's going on. That's part of how our minds fill in those blanks. So, going back, when I talk about structure, I mean this: the volumes, the shapes, the overall concept of how that body is put together. Now, it may translate into a more volume or a drawing that's more like this, where you have the value as a key part of your structure, or drawing more like this, where you have line as more of your structure. And usually what's going to happen is one or the other is going to dominate. Now you can see in this one, the value is basically dominating. The base structure is built on the volume. And there are areas like this where he allows the line to almost disappear. And it works because you have this structure of the volumes being held together by the light and the dark. Where you do have some areas like this beautiful little accent line, what that shows is that you can still bring in line into a structure that's built on value. And that little bit of a structure will be accented by that line. Not made worse, but actually accented and made better. Now, I don't know about the Prud'homme drawing, but yeah, you can see even here he's used some line in the face to help delineate the background from the foreground. But that little bit of line ends up being a beautiful accent in the context of all of this value as the basic structure. So feel free to move back and forth between the two, but remember, one or the other is usually going to dominate the piece. Well, I hope that's helpful for everyone. I know that's a concept that can be a little bit tricky, and it can be a little tricky to think about how it applies. But I hope that this presentation gives you a little bit more of a sense of what that word means when I use it.